There is a particular kind of quiet that exists only on rural roads in the middle of winter. No traffic. No street lights. Just wind moving through bare trees, and snow falling into the dark in a way that swallows sound before it can travel very far. The snow does not fall gently here. It moves sideways, caught in the wind that funnels down through the White Mountains and along a narrow 2-lane road called Route 112. It is just past 7:30 in the evening, on February 9, 2004, and the road is almost entirely empty. Then, ahead, something is wrong. A black sedan sits nose first against a snowbank, its front end crumpled, its headlights still on, throwing 2 long cones of light into the falling snow. A man in a school bus, driving home for the night, slows down. He sees the car. He sees a young woman standing near it. She looks shaken. She does not look badly hurt. She tells him she has already called for help. A tow truck is coming, she says. AAA is on the way. He offers to notify the police anyway, just to be safe. She does not want him to. He leaves. He drives the short distance home, snow collecting on his windshield faster than his wipers can clear it. Something about the moment doesn't sit entirely right with him. Nothing he could easily name, just a small, persistent unease that follows him the whole way. And because of that unease, once he's home, he picks up the phone and calls the police anyway. It is a small thing. A courtesy call about a minor accident on a snowy road, the kind of call a dispatcher takes 100 times a winter. Somewhere between the ringing telephone and the arrival of the first patrol car, something happens that no one has ever been able to fully explain. By the time an officer reaches the scene, no more than 15 or 20 minutes later, the woman is gone. The car is still there. The engine is off. The doors are locked. Inside, there are schoolbooks, a box of wine, a stuffed animal, directions to a city 2 hours north. Everything a person would need for a trip is still sitting in the passenger seat. The person who was standing beside that car only minutes earlier is not. Her name was Maura Murray. She was 21 years old. And on a dark road in rural New Hampshire, in the time it took a bus driver to reach his own house and dial a phone, she disappeared so completely that more than 2 decades of searching, science, and speculation have never produced a single confirmed trace of her. Where does a person go, in 10 minutes, on a snow-covered road, in the middle of winter, with no car, no phone reception, and nowhere obvious to run? That is the question this case has never answered. The mystery of Maura Murray, the girl who vanished into the snow. To understand what happened on Route 112, you first have to understand who was driving that car, and that story does not begin in New Hampshire. It begins 2.5 hours south, on a college campus in Amherst, Massachusetts, in the final days of a life that, from the outside, looked like it was going according to plan. Maura Murray was born on May 4, 1982, in Massachusetts, the 4th of 5 children in a close, athletic, Irish Catholic family. She grew up running. Literally, she was a standout on her high school track and cross-country teams, disciplined enough and driven enough that when the United States Military Academy at West Point offered her a place, she took it. For a young woman still in her teens, that alone said something about who she was. West Point does not accept people who drift. It accepts people who plan, who push, who compete. Maura Murray was the 4th of 5 children born to Fred and Lori Murray, raised in Hanson, Massachusetts, in a close-knit, athletic, Irish Catholic household. Her parents had divorced while she was young, but both remained active in her life. Her father, in particular, staying closely involved as she moved from high school athletics into the discipline of a military academy. Friends and family would later describe her as fiercely competitive, someone who ran not for leisure but because running was, in some sense, how she processed everything else. But Maura's time at West Point did not last. She left before completing her studies, the exact circumstances have never been made fully public, and enrolled instead at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she began working toward a nursing degree. It is tempting, in hindsight, to search a decision like that for foreshadowing, to ask whether leaving West Point was the first thread in a story that would end on a New Hampshire roadside. There is no evidence that it was. People leave military academies for all kinds of ordinary reasons. What matters for this story is simply that Maura's path was not a straight line, and that somewhere inside that path, there may have been more pressure than the people closest to her ever fully saw. On paper, this looked like a redirection, not a derailment. She was still an athlete. She was still ambitious. She was in a long-distance relationship with her boyfriend, Bill Roche, a fellow West Point cadet. Friends and instructors described her as intelligent, capable, well-liked. Whatever was happening beneath that surface, we don't have a definitive record of it. What we do have is a pattern. Small, scattered pieces of a young woman under more strain than the people around her fully understood. In late 2003, Maura pleaded to a minor fraud charge after using a stolen credit card number to order food, a charge that was set to be dismissed after a period of good behavior. In early February 2004, she was involved in a minor car accident in a parking lot near West Point, damaging the vehicle her father had helped her buy. On February 5, 4 days before she disappeared, Maura had what witnesses at her campus security job described as an emotional breakdown, apparently connected to a phone call from her older sister, Kathleen, who was struggling with alcoholism. Maura was escorted back to her dorm room, able only to say, "My sister." 2 days later, on February 7, her father, Fred Murray, drove up to visit her. Officially, he was there to help her shop for a replacement car after the parking lot accident. It was, by every account, an ordinary father-daughter weekend, the kind that leaves no reason for anyone involved to remember it in unusual detail, until later, when every detail becomes unusual by necessity. Roommates and classmates who spoke with investigators afterward painted a picture of someone functioning, if strained, attending classes, completing assignments, maintaining the outward rhythm of a nursing student's life even as something underneath that rhythm seemed to be fraying. None of them reported anything that, in isolation, looked like a warning sign. It was only afterward, looking back across the full week, that the small things, the breakdown, the minor accidents, the late-night emails, started to look like they belonged to the same unraveling thread. Nobody watching Maura Murray that weekend believed they were watching the final days of her known life. And that's what makes February 9th so difficult to reconstruct. It doesn't look like the day someone plans a disappearance. It looks like an ordinary Monday, right up until it doesn't. The known timeline of that day begins in the early hours of the morning, when Maura, still awake at 3:32 a.m., emailed a nursing school assignment to her classmates. A few hours later, just before 1 in the afternoon, she placed a 3-minute phone call to a woman named Linda Salamone, the owner of a condominium in Bartlett, New Hampshire, where Maura had stayed with her father and her boyfriend the previous summer. Salamone would later say she didn't remember the call, and confirmed she hadn't rented Maura a unit. At 1 o'clock, Maura emailed Bill. The tone was affectionate, ordinary. Nothing in it suggested a young woman about to vanish. Then, in the afternoon, everything shifts. Sometime around 4 o'clock, Maura is believed to have picked up duplicate copies of accident report forms from the local police station, paperwork connected to her earlier crash. Those forms would later be found in her car. And at some point that afternoon, Maura emailed her professors and her academic advisor. She told them there had been a death in her family. She asked to be excused from her coursework. There had been no death. Investigators would spend years trying to understand why she said that, and whether it was connected to what came next, or simply one more strange, isolated decision in a day full of them. That afternoon, she also withdrew a significant amount of cash from her bank account and purchased close to $40 worth of alcohol. She packed belongings from her dorm room. None of this, the withdrawal, the alcohol, the packing, the fabricated excuse, was shared with the people closest to her. Not with Bill. Not with her family. Not with her roommates. By the early evening, Maura Murray was in her car, driving north, alone, into a snowstorm, toward a part of New Hampshire she had visited before but had no obvious reason to be driving toward that particular night. At 4:37 p.m., she made her last recorded phone call, to her own voicemail. It lasted 4 minutes. Investigators have never been able to determine, with certainty, whose messages she was listening to, or what was in them. At 7:17 p.m., cell phone records show a roughly 20-minute call to Bill Roche, followed by 2 shorter calls later that evening. And then, at approximately 7:27 p.m., on a sharp, unforgiving curve of Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, Maura Murray's black Saturn left the road. We are back where we began. But now we know more about the person behind the wheel. And somehow, that makes the moment harder to watch, not easier. A local resident named Faith Westman heard the impact and looked out toward the road. She would later describe seeing a person near the car. By some accounts, a man. By her husband's account, possibly just the reddish glow of movement in the dark. It's one of many small details in this case that different witnesses remember differently, and one that investigators have never fully resolved. Minutes later, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood was heading home when he came upon the scene. He stopped. He spoke with Maura. According to Atwood, she seemed shaken but physically unhurt. When he offered to call for help, she told him she'd already contacted AAA, a claim that phone records would later show was untrue. She did not want the police involved. Atwood left. He drove home. And despite what Maura had told him, he decided to call the police anyway. A decision that, in hindsight, is one of the last ordinary, well-intentioned acts in this entire case. Faith Westman's 911 call went out at 7:27 p.m. Officer Cecil Smith of the Haverhill Police was dispatched 2 minutes later, at 7:29. By some later estimates, based on his route and road conditions that night, the drive to the crash site would have taken somewhere between 15 and 18 minutes. 15 to 18 minutes. That is the window. That is the entire, terrible window in which a 21-year-old woman, last seen standing beside her wrecked car in a snowstorm on a rural road with no reliable cell service, needed to either choose to leave or be taken. It's worth sitting with that window for a moment, because everything about this case lives inside it. 15 to 18 minutes is not very long. It is roughly the length of this chapter of the story you're watching right now. In that time, on foot, in winter boots, on an icy road, in the dark, a person moving briskly might cover a mile. Maybe slightly more, if adrenaline was working in her favor and the terrain cooperated. It is not enough time to walk far into deep wilderness and disappear without any trace, unless the woods themselves, dense, uneven, riddled with streams, worked against the searchers rather than for them. It is, however, more than enough time for a car to arrive, idle at the roadside for a minute or two, and leave again. Untraceable, unremarkable, one set of headlights among many that might have passed along Route 112 that night, if anyone had been watching, which nobody was. That is the uncomfortable math at the center of this case. The same 15 minutes that make an unassisted disappearance into the wilderness seem almost implausible are the same 15 minutes that make an unwitnessed pickup entirely plausible. Investigators have never been able to close that gap with anything more certain than possibility. And there's a smaller, colder detail buried inside all of it. February in the White Mountains does not just conceal evidence. It erases it. A trail of footprints crossing a road can vanish beneath a few hours of steady snowfall. A struggle, if there was one, might leave marks that no longer exist by morning. The weather that made Maura's crash more likely to happen is the same weather that made the truth of what happened afterward almost impossible to preserve. When Officer Smith arrived, the Saturn was there. The engine was off. The doors were locked. Maura was not. She was not injured on the roadside. She was not waiting in a nearby house. She was gone. The investigation that followed would spend the better part of 2 decades trying to answer a single question buried inside that gap of 15 to 18 minutes. What happens to a person in that much time, in that much cold, on that little road? When investigators searched the Saturn, what they found only deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. Inside were Maura's schoolbooks, a spilled box of Franzia wine, an empty beer bottle, gloves, CDs, a stuffed animal, a book titled Not Without Peril, and MapQuest directions pointing toward Burlington, Vermont, a city roughly 3 hours further north from where she crashed. The duplicate accident report forms from earlier that day were there too. So, oddly, was a rag stuffed into the vehicle's tailpipe, something investigators have never definitively explained. What was missing was just as significant. Her backpack, her cell phone, her debit and credit cards, none of which were ever used again. If Maura Murray walked away from that car under her own power, she appears to have taken with her exactly the things a person would need to keep going somewhere. If she didn't walk away on her own, someone else made sure those items disappeared along with her. Search and rescue teams brought in cadaver dogs within days. One dog picked up a scent trail leading east from the crash site, for roughly 100 yards. Then the trail stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The most common interpretation is that a scent trail ending abruptly, in that manner, suggests a person got into a vehicle. It is not proof. It is a strong, unsettling possibility, one piece of physical evidence in a case that has almost none. Search and rescue professionals are careful about how much weight to put on a single trained dog's read of a single scene, especially one contaminated by falling snow, passing emergency vehicles, and the footsteps of everyone who arrived before the dog did. 100 yards and a hard stop is suggestive. It is not conclusive. But in a case with so little else to hold on to, it has become one of the most repeated, most argued over details in the entire file, cited by some as near proof of a pickup, dismissed by others as an artifact of a difficult, contaminated scene. From there, the search widened. A "be on the lookout" notice went out the following morning, February 10th. By February 11th, New Hampshire Fish and Game had launched an extensive ground search, teams moving methodically through the trees on either side of Route 112, dogs working the wind for scent, snowmobiles cutting trails into terrain no ordinary vehicle could reach, thermal imaging equipment scanning for any heat signature that didn't belong to the forest itself. State police, local volunteers, and members of the Murray family combed the area for days, then weeks. Divers searched the nearby wild Ammonoosuc River and Connecticut River tributaries once conditions allowed. None of it produced a body, a piece of clothing, or a confirmed sighting. As winter gave way to spring, and the snow that had covered so much of the terrain finally melted, searchers half expected the thaw to reveal something. It revealed nothing. This is where the landscape itself becomes part of the story. The White Mountains in February are not gentle. The terrain around Haverhill is steep, forested, and cut through with streams and ravines that freeze and thaw unpredictably. A search here is not like a search across an open field. Snow conceals as much as it reveals, and what it conceals in November may not surface again until spring, if it surfaces at all. None of that makes the case supernatural. It makes it logistically brutal, and it means that even a completely conventional explanation for Maura's disappearance, tragic but ordinary, could remain physically unconfirmed for years, simply because of where and when it happened. There is a particular arrogance in believing that any landscape can be fully searched. Search teams work in grids, in patterns, in daylight, with dogs and thermal cameras and decades of training. And still, the White Mountains cover roughly 750,000 acres of terrain, much of it steep, densely wooded, and seasonally impassable. A search team can walk within 30 feet of something and never see it, if the season, the snowfall, or simple chance conspires against them. This is not a criticism of the searchers. It is a fact about wilderness that this case has forced an entire online audience to reckon with, one renewed search at a time. Roughly 2 days after the disappearance, Maura's boyfriend, Bill Roche, received a strange voicemail, muffled, with what sounded like faint sobbing, from a number tied to a prepaid calling card. It has never been conclusively linked to Maura, and it has never been definitively ruled out either. It is exactly the kind of detail that keeps a case like this alive online for 20 years. Tantalizing, unverifiable, impossible to close the door on. Imagine receiving that voicemail. Imagine playing it once, then again, then a dozen more times, trying to decide whether the sound underneath the static is a voice you know, or simply the shape your own hope is bending it into. Bill Roche has spoken publicly, sparingly, about that period in the years since. A young man who lost the person he was building a future with, without ever being given the basic mercy of knowing why. Whatever that call actually was, it was never traced conclusively to Maura, and it was never fully explained. By the time investigators had exhausted the physical search, they were left with a much harder task, building theories out of very little evidence, and trying not to mistake a compelling story for a true one. The first and most straightforward theory is also the bleakest, that Maura, disoriented, possibly having been drinking, left the road on foot into the woods or toward the nearby wild Ammonoosuc River, and succumbed to exposure in the freezing temperatures that night, her remains never recovered in the dense, difficult terrain. This explanation fits the setting. It fits the cold. It fits a young woman who, by her own actions that day, appears to have been in some kind of crisis. But it struggles against the physical evidence, a scent trail that seems to end at a road rather than trailing off into wilderness, and an extensive, well-resourced search that, across the following weeks, found absolutely nothing to support it. Investigators considered this theory seriously in the earliest days. It has never been confirmed. The second theory holds that Maura got into a vehicle, voluntarily or not, in the gap between Atwood driving away and the police arriving. This is where the case grows genuinely uncomfortable, because it requires believing that someone else was there, on an isolated road, in a snowstorm, within that same narrow window of time. Some researchers point to the abruptly ending scent trail as support for this. Others note that Maura had explicitly told Atwood she didn't want help, and ask whether that reflects someone planning to be picked up, someone trying to avoid a legal consequence like a license suspension, or something else entirely. New Hampshire officials have publicly acknowledged pursuing leads connected to unidentified individuals who may have been in the area that night, without confirming who, or what, if anything, was found. For this theory to be true, several things would have had to line up almost perfectly. A vehicle would have had to be present, or arrive, within that same narrow window. Whoever was driving it would have had to either know Maura or encounter her by pure chance, on an isolated road, in a snowstorm, at exactly the moment she needed a way out. And whatever happened next, a ride toward somewhere else, or something far worse, would have had to leave no trace visible to a bus driver, a neighbor, or the police officer who arrived only minutes later. None of that is impossible. Rural roads do carry occasional traffic even in a storm. But it does require believing in a degree of coincidence, or premeditation, that has never been proven either way. A third theory, one that has circulated for years, largely online, suggests that Maura orchestrated her own disappearance, that the fabricated family death, the withdrawn cash, the packed belongings, and the vague directions to Vermont all point toward a young woman under enormous private strain, trying to walk away from her own life. Under this theory, the crash itself becomes almost incidental, an accident that simply happened to occur during a planned departure. It's a theory that fits some of the behavioral evidence disturbingly well. It struggles against the practicalities. No confirmed use of her bank cards afterward, no contact with friends or family in over 20 years, and the sheer difficulty of vanishing completely, on foot, in a rural area, in the middle of a February snowstorm, with nothing but what she was carrying. For a planned disappearance to be true, Maura would have needed a destination, a way to travel there without leaving any financial or digital footprint, and the discipline to maintain total silence toward every single person who loved her for the rest of her life, including a father who had just spent the weekend helping her shop for a car, and a boyfriend she had spoken to for 20 minutes only hours before the crash. It is not impossible. People have vanished by choice before. But it asks a great deal of a young woman who, for days earlier, had been too distraught to speak more than 2 words to a supervisor. And a fourth, darker possibility has never been ruled out by investigators, either, that someone harmed Maura, either connected to the crash itself or entirely separate from it. New Hampshire's Attorney General's office has, at various points over the past 2 decades, confirmed that the case remains open and, at times, has described it using language associated with a possible crime rather than a simple accident, without ever publicly naming a suspect. It is worth being direct about something here. Over the years, various names have circulated in online communities, podcasts, and amateur investigations. People who knew Maura, people who lived near the crash site, people connected only by geography or coincidence. Some of these individuals have spoken publicly to defend themselves against speculation that reached far beyond anything law enforcement ever confirmed. None has ever been officially named a suspect by New Hampshire authorities. This documentary will not repeat those allegations. Suspicion is not evidence, and a real family has already carried enough uncertainty without adding unproven accusations to it. What can be said plainly is this: investigators have never found her car keys, her phone, or any of her belongings outside that vehicle. They have never recovered a body. They have never announced an arrest. Every theory that has been proposed in 22 years explains some of the evidence and fails to explain the rest. That, more than any single detail, is what makes this case different from a story with a hidden solution waiting to be uncovered. This isn't a puzzle with one missing piece. It's 4 incomplete pictures, each one plausible, each one damaged by a fact that refuses to fit. The exposure theory can't explain the search dogs. The pickup theory can't explain the absence of a single confirmed witness on an otherwise empty road. The planned disappearance theory can't explain 22 years of silence toward people who loved her without condition. And the possibility of foul play, the one investigators have never publicly closed the door on, has never produced a name they've been willing to say out loud. Maybe that's the part of this case that's hardest to sit with. Not that we don't know what happened to Maura Murray. It's that, after everything, the dogs, the divers, the thermal cameras, the 22 years of tips and searches and renewed investigations, nobody has ever found enough to rule anything out. Then the years began to pass, and the case changed shape, the way cold cases always do. Not because the mystery became less important, but because the world around it kept moving. In the months after Maura's disappearance, her case was featured on America's Most Wanted, generating a wave of public tips. None led to a confirmed sighting. As the years went on, what had started as a regional missing persons case became something else entirely. One of the first major disappearances to be dissected, debated, and mythologized across the emerging landscape of internet forums, blogs, and eventually podcasts and true crime YouTube channels. Every detail of that February night, the AAA lie, the fabricated death, the abandoned car, has been picked apart by strangers who never met her, searching for a pattern that investigators, with all their resources, have never been able to confirm. There is something almost fitting, and something almost cruel, about the fact that Maura Murray disappeared just before the world became permanently, obsessively online. Her case arrived at the exact moment message boards were learning how to turn a missing person into a shared mystery, a puzzle anyone could contribute a theory to, at any hour, from anywhere. Amateur investigators built timelines more detailed than some official case files. Podcasters recorded hundreds of hours of speculation. Documentary crews retraced her route down to the minute. Some of that attention has helped. Public pressure is part of why the case has never been allowed to go quiet, part of why resources have periodically been renewed, part of why a family with limited institutional power has still managed to keep investigators engaged for over 2 decades. But some of it has hurt. Rumors calcify into accepted fact simply through repetition. Innocent people who happen to live nearby, or happen to know Maura years earlier, have found themselves named in comment sections as though suspicion were the same thing as guilt. A real, ongoing tragedy has occasionally been treated like content, solvable, bingeable, resolved by the next upload. This documentary is part of that same tradition, and it isn't going to pretend otherwise. The responsible version of that tradition is the one that keeps a genuine question alive without inventing a false answer to satisfy it. Through all of it, Maura's family has never stopped pushing. Her sister, Julie Murray, has spent years building public awareness of the case, corresponding with investigators, and advocating not just for Maura but for other families living inside the same unbearable uncertainty. In 2025, Julie and other advocates held a public accountability event in New Hampshire, calling for greater resources for cold cases across the state. Around that same time, New Hampshire's Cold Case Unit, which had operated for years with a single part-time investigator, expanded to 2 full-time positions. "My family has waited over 2 decades for answers about Maura," Julie Murray has said publicly. "And we're not alone. Too many families have carried unbearable burdens while hearing too little from investigators. There is a particular kind of grief that has no ending point to move toward. No funeral, no verdict, no single day that draws a line under everything. For the Murray family, every February 9th arrives again anyway, whether the case has moved forward that year or not. Vigils have been held. Anniversaries marked, quietly, publicly, sometimes both. Fred and Lori Murray raised 4 other children through all of it, and none of those years came with the thing every family in their position is owed most, an answer. It would be easy for a documentary like this one to linger too long on that grief, to treat it as another dramatic beat in the story. It shouldn't be. The Murrays did not choose this. They have simply had to build a life around a question that refuses to close, 1 anniversary, 1 press release, 1 age progression photo at a time. In July 2022, New Hampshire's Attorney General announced a new, large-scale search of the mountainous terrain surrounding the crash site, 18 years after Maura disappeared, using search techniques and equipment that simply hadn't existed in 2004. Officials briefed the Murray family before making the search public, a small but meaningful gesture in a case where the family has often learned about developments the same way the rest of the public does. The search, like every one before it, ended without a discovery. 18 years is long enough for an entire childhood to happen. Long enough for the officer who first responded to that crash to retire. Long enough for the road itself to be repaved, for guardrails to be replaced, for the hairpin curve on Route 112 to be driven by thousands of people who have no idea what happened there, or who slow down deliberately because they do. And still, in the summer of 2022, teams walked that same mountainside again, looking for the same answer nobody had found the first time, or the second, or the third. In February 2024, on the 20th anniversary of her disappearance, the FBI released an age progression image of what Maura might look like as a woman in her 40s. A quiet, almost unbearable acknowledgement that, as far as anyone officially knows, she could still be out there. And the case has not gone quiet since. In December 2025, officials with the New Hampshire Attorney General's office confirmed they were actively utilizing new investigative technology, tools that did not exist when Maura vanished, applying them to existing evidence and any new information that surfaces. On the 22nd anniversary of her disappearance, in February 2026, New Hampshire's Cold Case Unit reaffirmed that the case remains a daily priority, stating that their determination to find answers does not diminish, and asking the public to come forward with anything, however small, that might matter. By 2026, rumors of a major breakthrough, new belongings recovered, forensic fiber evidence, a definitive new suspect, had begun circulating widely online. Investigators have not confirmed any of these specific claims. What they have confirmed repeatedly and consistently is that the case remains open, that it is being actively worked, and that no one has yet been arrested or charged. That distinction matters. In a case defined by 22 years of noise, the difference between a real development and an internet rumor is often the only thing standing between Maura's story and pure speculation. So where does that leave us? 22 years, thousands of tips, multiple large-scale searches, and no confirmed trace later. Picture it again. Not as an isolated accident this time, as the last visible point of a much longer story. A car leaves the road on a sharp curve in the dark. A neighbor hears it and looks out her window. A school bus slows down, and a driver who has no reason to remember this night for the rest of his life gets out to check on a stranger. He drives away believing the situation is handled. 2 minutes later, a call reaches a dispatcher, and an officer starts his car toward Route 112, unaware that he is now in a race he doesn't know he's running. Somewhere in the 15 minutes that follow, the same 15 minutes it takes this chapter of the film to unfold, a 21-year-old woman standing beside a wrecked car either begins walking into the trees, or steps into headlights that do not belong to the police. We will likely never know, with certainty, which. It leaves us back where we started. On a dark curve of Route 112, in the snow, in February. We know Maura was there. We know her car was there. We know a bus driver stopped and spoke with her, and that she was alive, and afraid enough to lie about having already called for help. We know a neighbor heard the crash and called the police. We know an officer was dispatched within 2 minutes of that call. And we know that somewhere in the 15 or 18 minutes it took him to arrive, Maura Murray disappeared from a public road in rural New Hampshire so completely that more than 2 decades of dogs, diverse, thermal cameras, forensic advances, and public attention have never found her. Roads get repaved. Technology changes almost beyond recognition. The people who knew Maura in 2004 have grown into different versions of themselves, carrying a question that has never once been allowed to close. Somewhere in that gap between the crash and the arrival of the police, an entire life either ended or continued, and to this day, nobody outside of whatever happened in those minutes actually knows which. Somewhere between the last moment Maura Murray was seen standing beside her car, and the moment the first police cruiser's headlights found nothing but snow and an empty road, her story disappeared along with her, and it has never come back. She was 21. She ran track. She wanted to be a nurse. She loved someone, and was loved back. She made a series of small, strange choices on one particular Monday that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. And then she drove north, into a snowstorm, and into a mystery that has now outlasted her own remembered life by more than 20 years. Whatever happened to her in those 15 minutes on Route 112, it happened to a real person. Not a case number. Not a theory. A 21-year-old woman who, by every account of the people who knew her, was supposed to come home. If you want to go deeper into the world's most enduring unsolved cases, subscribe to the channel, because somewhere out there, another mystery is still waiting for someone to ask the right question.